Okay, so yesterday I said I was working on trying to understand who has produced consequential amounts of loving on the planet throughout history, and that I'd report out on that progress, having done several more hours work on it. I've broadened it a bit, looking at the broader question of not necessarily who, but what has brought increased consequential amounts of loving. And this is the initial list that I'm working with. So psychologists like Alfred Adler, reporters like Amy Goodman, activists like Colonel Ann Wright, anti-apartheid victims, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Buddha, business people, Chomsky, civil rights victims, civil rights workers, and I'll see if I can just kind of scroll down. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, so-called Christianity in the form of Christians, psychologist Daniel Goleman, who's looked at emotional quotient EQ as opposed to IQ, Charles Dickens, the author, Eleanor Roosevelt, entertainers, extreme emergencies, tsunamis, for example, Norman Finkelstein, the great advocate for justice in the Middle East, Francis of Assisi, Gandhi, the Muslim frontier Gandhi, Ghaffar Khan, a contemporary of Gandhi's, heroes, Holocaust rescuers, Jesus as distinct from Christianity, the man Jesus, Jews, lawyers, Lincoln, loving rich, example-rich environments, lust-poor environments, Nelson Mandela, the psychologist Abraham Maslow, massive oppression such as we've seen in Egypt for 30 years, or in the slave South, or in the South prior to civil rights, and maybe ongoing, the media, men and women in uniform, ministers, Martin Luther King, monasteries, and the like. That monk that years ago, thousands of years ago, jumped into the Colosseum, shortly after which the games stopped in Rome, as I understand it, permanently. Muslims, nurses, doctors, EMTs, medical personnel, the Obamas, philosophy, politicians, people with unexplained but obvious predisposition toward loving, as separate from any of these environmental factors. Psychology, the great activist Rachel Corrie, exterminated so young by the right-wing Israeli regime for protecting a Palestinian home. The psychologist Carl Rogers, saintly citizens. 1 out of 2 saintly parents in a house home, 2 out of 2 saintly parents in a household. A saint-rich life, that is, living throughout one's life in an environment that is saint-rich. Scholars, academics, Albert Schweitzer, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Science and scientists, the self-immolating Buddhists of the past and present. Sociology, the great sociologist Pitaram Sorokin, sports figures, teachers of the older folks, teachers of the young, like elementary or nursery school teachers. Temptation-poor environments, that is, devoid of temptations of the head and flesh. Teresa of Calcutta. Leo Tolstoy, the author that seems to have created Gandhi, and maybe Dr. King as well, with his writings on the Greek translations of Jesus' teachings. True need-rich environments. An extremely needy town, for example, or an impoverished area of a country. Wael Ghonim and the other young Egyptian revolutionaries that helped serve as catalyst for the Arab Spring a year ago. Brian Wilson, the great activist. Diane Wilson, the current great activist. Writers in general. Howard Zinn. Now, the first thing I looked at was, for each of these categories, how many people saved per year. I then looked at how many people destroyed per year. And then collateral damage. And then a net of those, so saved per year, minus destroyed per year, minus collateral damage per year, would equal a net saved per year. Now, this is purely thought experiment. Having said that, I've devoted my life to trying to understand these things. So it should be meaningful to other honest truth seekers, but it is meaningful to me in terms of looking for orders of magnitude and thinking through the problem. And then finally, short-term impact. So, for example, Wael Ghonim and the Egyptian revolutionaries, a huge short-term impact of moving people in the direction of loving and out of head and flesh. Now, if I can manipulate this quickly enough, I'll check my sort here, and first I'll sort on saved per year. From largest to smallest. And this is what I looked at first. So looking at the first and second columns here, rising to the top in my thought experiment was that people existing in loving-rich, example-rich environments, extremely healthy households and towns where extremely loving, maybe Aboriginal communities, are among those that produce relatively large numbers of people saved from wasting their lives on living out of the selfish head and flesh instead of the heart. Also fairly large numbers from simply a genetic or environmental or happenstance predisposition toward loving. The man Jesus, as distinct from Christianity, was instrumental in saving Gandhi from a wasted life of pursuing pleasure through the head and the flesh. My guess is that, well, that clearly is what I experience as saving me, along with my biological father saving me. Two saintly parents in a household. Pitirim Sorokin of Harvard, his work suggested that's the major source of generating what we understand to be saints. The saint-rich life, and I don't mean a saint as approved by some hard organism called the Church or the Catholic Church. I mean what we general in the population would refer to as a saint, a heroically loving person. Worthy of mention, Buddha, which I know relatively little about, but the monks currently self-immolating themselves strike me as heroes of love, whether or not I fully agree with their tactics. Norman Finkelstein, through selfless devotion to Palestinians as an American Jew, is, I suspect, significantly moving a number of people per year out of head and flesh into selfless heart. Lust-poor environments, environments where television, Hollywood media are examples around one of sex being the ultimate value, are relatively poor. So I would distinguish that environments poor or devoid of people living for lust as distinct from environments that are not laden with bars on every corner, or a lifestyle that sanctifies lust, as our overprivileged in the Western culture and the American culture do. Teresa of Calcutta, I suspect, saves significant numbers of people per year. No, she's not alive, but her work, her example, and her ongoing work are men and women in uniform, police, nurses, police, soldiers, in their heroic work, I suspect, move many people, either keeping them in the heart or moving them out of head and flesh into heart. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum. So, particularly low on the totem pole, or on this measure, I've not yet rated these. Sorry for the confusion. Massive oppression. So in apartheid South Africa, or a oppressive Egypt, probably produces 100 heroes a year, so that's relatively large in resorting that would go toward the top. Extreme emergencies. Katrina brought forth thousands of heroes. The tsunami brought forth thousands of heroes. Having said that, how permanent were they? So maybe permanent 10 a year, 1 a year, but short-term impact. A thousand, but not long-term impact. Oh, Howard Zinn, the great intellectual, People's History of the United States, I don't think moves many people. It stimulates their heads, lots of lip service, lots of mental masturbation. Psychology, Muslims, Jews, Christians, the religions, their purpose is to humanize us, and they have incredibly failed. Noam Chomsky, the great intellectual, I don't think he moves people into their heart. He doesn't move them into heroic action. I'm not condemning him, but I don't think he does. Business people don't. Teachers of the old, I don't think so. We're too fixed In our nervous systems, they've been too misfigured to have much impact in teaching older people. Sports figures continuing to move from the bottom here. Science, it could, but we use it for selfishness. It doesn't move us into our heart. Ministers, they don't. They move us into hate and superiority as much as anything. Tremendous individual heroes like Diane Wilson, the environment.